Aramoana, a tiny coastal town in New Zealand, where everyone knew each other's names, where children played freely in nature, and where doors were rarely locked. But on one November day in 1990, that peaceful land was stained with blood. In less than 24 hours, 13 lives were taken by the hands of a man the whole town thought was just ... A little odd. A lone gunman, quietly stockpiling weapons and harboring a slow-burning hatred toward the world, turned the serene village into a scene of horror. The Aramoana Massacre wasn't the result of some organized plot, nor were there clear warning signs. It started with a small argument between neighbors and ended with one of the largest manhunts in New Zealand's history, involving special forces, helicopters, and gunfire echoing through streets that once knew only birdsong. No one could have predicted that the nation's worst nightmare would begin with someone who lived just down the street. This is the full story of the Aramoana Massacre, the event that forced all of New Zealand to confront the terrifying danger of angry loners hiding in plain sight. On the evening of November 13th, around 7:30 p.m., in the quiet coastal town of Aramoana, a confrontation erupted just outside a small family home. Gary Holden had merely stepped into his yard when a man, his neighbor, blocked his path. The reason? One of Holden's young daughters had accidentally wandered onto the man's property. It should have ended with a few harsh words, but in that moment, something unthinkable happened. The man turned his back, walked into his house, and returned with a Norinco 84S semi-automatic rifle. Without a single warning, he opened fire. Bullets ripped through Gary Holden's chest in seconds. As Holden collapsed, the gunman calmly approached and delivered a final shot to his head. Cold, precise, calculated. And it was only the beginning of the nightmare. Just nearby, 3 little girls, Chiquita, Jasmine, Holden's daughter, and Rhea, his partner's child, had witnessed everything. They screamed and bolted into the house in panic. But he didn't stop. Like a predator, he followed silently behind them. Armed now with a .222 caliber rifle, he fired multiple times. One bullet struck her chest, another tore through her arm, and a third embedded in her stomach. Despite excruciating pain, Chiquita somehow got back on her feet, sprinting past her father's lifeless body, heading for the only place she believed could still be safe, the home of Julie Ann Bryson, their neighbor. Meanwhile, the chaos hadn't ended on Holden's property. Jasmine and Rhea were captured and mercilessly executed, and as if that weren't enough, he set the house on fire. Flames devoured the home, reducing everything inside to ashes, his twisted idea of erasing all traces. At the far end of the street, Julie Ann Bryson was just beginning to grasp what was happening. When she realized that her daughter and Gary Holden's daughter were still inside the burning house, she didn't hesitate. Acting on instinct, she jumped into her truck with wounded little Chiquita and sped straight toward the blaze. But as they approached, gunfire suddenly ripped through the windshield. The gunman was still there. He hadn't stopped. And he wouldn't. Aramoana descended into panic. Holden's house burned like a beacon of horror, and the sound of gunshots echoed across the twilight sky. Fear spread like wildfire. People fled, screamed, called out for loved ones. Chaos gripped the town. Nearby, a group of locals riding a small utility vehicle pulled up, thinking they could help. They didn't know. A killer was lurking in the dark, ready to open fire on anyone who came close. Without warning, he opened fire on the group. Bullets slammed into metal, glass shattered, and screams echoed through the once peaceful streets. Vanessa Percy tried to run. Her footsteps pounded the pavement, panicked, desperate, but it was too late. Multiple rounds tore into her back, dropping her instantly. Every effort to save her failed. Vanessa died at the scene just hours later. Then he turned his gun on the children. Leo Wilson, Diane Percy, and their sister Stacy were trapped in the line of fire. The two boys never stood a chance. Bullets struck them both, killing them on the spot. Young lives ended in seconds, cold and brutal. Stacy was hit in the stomach, bleeding, in agony, but still breathing. Their father, Ross Percy, had just driven them home after a peaceful day of fishing. He was next. A single shot to the head ended his life instantly. What was supposed to be a quiet family evening ... became a massacre. But the bloodshed wasn't over yet. Before we dive further into the horrors this man unleashed, we need to go back to understand who he really was. David Malcolm Gray, born on November 20th, 1956, in Dunedin, New Zealand. At the time of the Aramoana Massacre, Gray was 33 years old. Before his name became a cursed stain in history, he had lived a life so quiet, so uneventful. It was almost like he didn't exist. Gray attended Port Chalmers Primary School, then moved on to Otago Boys High School. There was nothing remarkable about him, average grades, a quiet nature. Friends would later recall him as reserved, even humble. But that quietness, as many would say later, wasn't peace. It was distance. A quiet disconnection from the world around him. Those who knew Gray growing up described him as a loner, someone who never truly fit in. After leaving school, David Gray led a drifting life, occasionally taking seasonal farm jobs. But by 1990, he had been unemployed for years. His father passed away, and his mother died in 1985, a loss that sent Gray into a downward spiral. According to his sister, the death of their mother shattered him in a way he never recovered from. Not long after the funeral, Gray abandoned Port Chalmers and moved into the family's small holiday home in Aramoana, a secluded coastal community surrounded by ocean and overgrown brush. There, Gray all but disappeared from public life. He only showed up in a handful of familiar places, like Galaxy books and records on Lower Stewart Street in Dunedin. He was known for a strange obsession with military history and modern warfare. Store owner Bill Brosnan recalled Gray as a regular for over 7 years, often purchasing Soldier of Fortune magazines and books on combat tactics. But by the early 1990s, something changed. Gray once threatened a clerk with what looked like a gun hidden in a cardboard box, an incident so disturbing that Brosnan issued a permanent ban just a month later. While his sister claimed Gray loved animals, neighbors in Aramoana painted a very different picture. Especially troubling was his escalating tension with Gary Holden, who lived next door. Multiple pets from the Holden family began turning up dead under suspicious circumstances. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. And then, in November 1990, that simmering tension finally exploded into a blood-soaked rampage, one that would haunt the quiet seaside town of Aramoana forever. It became the most horrifying mass shooting in New Zealand's modern history. For years before the massacre, David Gray had been nothing more than a shadow at the edge of town, quiet, withdrawn, occasionally irritable, often ignored. He drifted through the community like a ghost no one truly saw, and no one really cared to understand. But that night, the shadow came alive, and it didn't come as a lost man. It came as a killer carrying death. Gray moved like a demon through the dark streets of Aramoana, going house to house with his rifle locked and loaded. He broke into the home of Tim Jamieson and executed him on the spot. Then he turned his sights on Vic Crimp, a respected elderly man and former mayor of Green Island, slaughtered in cold blood without a word. But the massacre was only just beginning. James Dixon had only stepped outside to look for his missing dog when David Gray gunned him down without hesitation. The shot tore through the night, echoing down the quiet streets and shattering the stillness. Inside, James's mother, Eva Helen Dixon, and their neighbor Chris Cole were jolted by the sound and rushed outside. Chris sprinted toward the nearest phone booth to call for help, but Gray spotted him. One shot, Chris went down. Eva, still recovering from a recent hip replacement, could barely move. She collapsed near the curb. But somehow, with bullets still flying, she dragged herself through the bushes, slipped into a stormwater ditch, and crawled home. Bleeding, shaking, she picked up the phone and dialed 111, New Zealand's emergency number. Her voice trembled, but her words gave police the first clear understanding of the horror unfolding in Aramoana. And Eva Helen Dixon didn't stop there. Wounded, exhausted, barely alive. But somehow, Eva Helen Dixon pulled herself back into the darkness, crawling toward Chris Cole, who lay motionless, blood soaking into the cold ground. "Help is coming," she whispered. It wasn't just comfort. It was a promise. A last thread of hope in a night ruled by death. But it was already too late. Chris Cole didn't make it. He died in the hospital, leaving behind a silence that would haunt Aramoana forever. That night, Aramoana became a war zone, and the man responsible, David Gray, was still out there, armed, ruthless, and hunting. The once peaceful air now choked with smoke, gunfire, and screams. As darkness settled over the seaside streets, a storm was brewing, not in the sky, but in the heart of the town. And those who would walk into that storm had no idea what kind of hell was waiting. Leading the charge was Sergeant Stuart Guthrie, a seasoned officer, and that night, the unshakable hero of Aramoana. He arrived on scene armed with nothing but a standard-issue Smith & Wesson Model 10 revolver, while the killer roamed free with military-grade weapons. In New Zealand, police don't routinely carry guns, but that night, the rules no longer mattered. As Guthrie surveyed the blood-soaked scene, he crossed paths with Officer Russell Anderson, who had just arrived with the fire crew. Realizing the scale of the massacre, Guthrie made a desperate but necessary call. He handed Anderson a civilian rifle. There was no time
spread through Aramoana like wildfire,
Aramoana was
with
burning,
the Holden House now
and only
engulfed
those
in
with
flames
weapons
and the
stood a
sound
chance
of
at stopping
gunshots
a maniac
echoing
armed to
across
the
the
teeth
darkening sky.
and hell-bent on
Neighbors
death.
began to panic.
He was in the process of telling us about his lack of vision so far as the offender was concerned, and then he continued with a warning to someone who was approaching him to stop or he would shoot. At that stage I left the radio. I knew something was going to happen. I was running to where another colleague was positioned, and I heard the volley of shots.
Was that person approaching him the offender?
Well, it could only have been.
As night sank deeper into chaos, first responders crept through a town in ruins. Flickers of fire from burning homes stretched ghostly shadows across blood-stained streets. And then they arrived. The place David Gray was believed to be hiding. Sergeant Stuart Guthrie didn't hesitate. He made the first tactical move of that fateful night. He stationed Officer Russell Anderson at the front of the house and then silently circled around back, knowing that's where the real danger lurked. With nerves of steel, Guthrie moved across the sand, approaching like a phantom. Meanwhile, Detective Paul Allen Knox and two other officers moved in from the opposite side, setting up a containment perimeter, textbook protocol for an armed offender. But tonight, the textbook had nothing to offer. Inside the pitch-dark house, the killer moved like a shadow. From behind the dunes, Guthrie whispered updates over his radio, his voice the only thread between order and total collapse. Suddenly, a glimpse. Gray's figure flickered into view, then vanished. Silence fell like a weight. And deep inside, Guthrie's instincts flared. Something wasn't right. He radioed a warning, telling nearby officers to hold position, because what was about to happen couldn't be undone. Suddenly, David Gray emerged from the front of the house. Officer Anderson raised his rifle, shouting a command that cut through the darkness. But Gray didn't run. He crouched low and vanished into the thick brush like a ghost. He wasn't fleeing. He was hunting. Meanwhile, Guthrie stayed motionless, hidden among the sand dunes by the beach. A shadow began to approach, and then from the dark gray stepped into view, gun raised. His silhouette was clear against the night. Guthrie rose, shouted a warning, told him to surrender. A warning shot cracked through the night air. For a moment, Gray seemed to hesitate. "Don't shoot," he shouted. Guthrie held his breath. Maybe, just maybe, it was over. But nightmares don't end that easily. In a split second, Gray lifted his rifle and fired. Bullets tore through the air. One struck Guthrie straight in the head. He dropped instantly. No final words. No chance of survival. Guthrie's death, an unarmed hero facing down a mass murderer, echoed through the night like a death knell. Just minutes later, reinforcements flooded into the town. An armed response team from Dunedin set up a blockade only 250 meters from Gray's possible escape route. An armored vehicle roared down the street, hauling heavy combat gear. Police from Christchurch, Timaru, and Invercargill were dispatched on emergency alert. But no one was under any illusions anymore. This killer didn't just have guns. He had scopes, skill, and a body count too long to ignore. No more warnings, no more negotiations. The order had been given. Shoot on sight. The manhunt was now fully underway. Gray was still out there armed, dangerous, and moving like a shadow through ash, dunes, and coastal brush. No one knew if he was lying in wait or planning his next move. But one thing was certain. This was no longer a crime scene. It was a war zone. And New Zealand was ready to play its strongest cards. Police Commissioner John Jamson issued an emergency mobilization order. The AT says the country's elite counterterrorism unit was being deployed. Trained for the worst-case scenarios, they knew one thing for certain. This time, it was real. Back then, they weren't yet called the Special Tactics Group. They were just a small team scattered across Christchurch, Wellington, and Auckland, with no military planes, no ready helicopters, and no central command. Before dawn on November 14th, agents dressed in black, MP5 submachine guns at their sides, boarded commercial flights in silence. No sirens, no armored vehicles, just men carrying urban warfare weapons, quietly blending in with civilians. It was a surreal sight, but the mission wouldn't wait. Blood had been spilled. A hero had fallen. And now the silent warriors were entering the field. The manhunt had begun. On the flight to Dunedin, it wasn't just the ATS agents on board. Police Minister John Banks, Commissioner Jameson, and Julie Holden, the daughter of slain victim Gary Holden, were also present. Julie had given the tactical team a detailed map of Aramoana, its winding alleys, hidden corners, escape routes, and most importantly, a portrait of the killer the entire nation was hunting. When the plane touched down in Dunedin, they were immediately swarmed by cameras and reporters. But there was no time for the press. A military bus was waiting, pushing its way through the panicked crowd to get them straight to Port Chalmers. There, local residents, still bloodied and trembling, became living witnesses, offering the ATS a chilling account of what Gray had done. Every alley, every house he'd overtaken, every death, all laid out in terrifying detail through broken voices and haunted eyes. Shortly after, the Air Force was called in. An RNZA FUH-1 H. Iroquois military helicopter roared in to provide air support. At first, it flew high, because earlier that very morning, Gray had fired at a civilian news chopper. No one could be sure he wouldn't do it again. But then, The steel bird dropped lower, slicing through the coastal brush with a howl of wind. On board, snipers and tactical officers stood poised to deploy. From the open bay, they hurled tear gas grenades into the thickets below, trying to flush the killer from his shadows. Tension thickened in the chopper. The crew had been flying for over 8 hours, circling, scanning, deploying snipers onto ridgelines like strategic shields around the town. Each landing was a gamble with death, because somewhere down there, David Gray was waiting, with a scoped rifle and nothing left to lose. On the ground, ATS agents split into two teams and finally linked up with the Tamaroo armed unit, who had held key positions through the long, bloody night. The order was clear and final: if he's armed, shoot to kill. No warnings. But while New Zealand's most elite forces closed in, David Gray, the man who turned a seaside town into a war zone, calmly slipped into a nearby home, fixed himself a snack, and fell asleep, unaware that the noose was tightening around him. Dawn broke over Aramoana on November 14th, casting a bleak golden light over the smoldering wreckage. But the nightmare wasn't over. At 6 a.m., counter-terror units from Christchurch moved silently into the ruined town, rifles loaded, boots crunching over shattered glass and dried blood. The morning air wasn't thick with fog, but with a deadly silence. Bodies lay scattered: friends, neighbors, children. Each step forward felt like walking through the gates of hell. The first target, David Gray's house, the epicenter of the massacre. ATS agents moved in with precision, forming cover teams, clearing each corner, their eyes locked on every shadow. As they closed in, the signal was given. A stun grenade was hurled through a window. The blast shattered the silence, rocking the neighborhood. Tear gas followed, pouring through the broken frame. Seconds later, the door was breached. Agents flooded in, weapons drawn, sweeping room after room. But there was no one inside. The house was empty. Gray had vanished. Yet his presence lingered in the scorched walls, the blood-stained floorboards, and the stench of gunpowder. He had slipped back into Aramoana like a ghost in the ashes. The mission wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. The ATS team pressed on, house by house, corner by corner, leaving no door unopened, no attic unchecked, no wardrobe ignored. They split into 2 units, sweeping the street like a tightly choreographed storm. Behind them, reinforcements poured in from Wanganui, Palmerston North, Napier, and New Plymouth, forming a tightening net around Aramoana. The quiet coastal town had become a war zone, with armed police on every street and in every yard. And then, in a silent garden, Hay found something cold lying still on the grass. Sergeant Stoyart Guthrie's service revolver, a painful symbol of the price they'd already paid. But in the midst of that grim tableau, a flicker of hope emerged. Inside an abandoned home, officers discovered a woman who had been hiding for over 20 hours beneath a
when
table.
They reached the property
Paralyzed
where the
with
killer
fear,
was believed
silent,
to be hiding,
unseen.
Guthrie made the first
Now she
tactical
crawled
call.
out from the
He
darkness,
positioned Anderson to
trembling
guard
but
the
alive,
front, knowing
a
full
miracle
well the
in the
real
middle of a
danger lay
nightmare.
behind.
And yet, the final confrontation was still ahead. As daylight began to fade, the search team spotted a small house on the northeastern edge of town. The windows were shattered. Dense fencing sealed off both sides. A fiberglass shed stood in the back. The whole scene felt too quiet. And then, like a ghost, a flicker of gray appeared in the window. Just for a split second. But for the team hunting him, that was enough. David Gray, the man who had unleashed hell, had just given himself away. What followed was a bloody confrontation, brutal and unavoidable. A stun grenade was thrown through the broken window, but Gray was ready. He had placed a mattress over the broken glass, and it bounced the grenade right back out, forcing the team to dive for cover. Seconds later, tear gas was launched in. The noxious cloud rolled through the hallway, wrapping the house in a deadly fog. And then, gunfire. Gray opened fire wildly, not directly at the officers, but from behind the house, from the fiberglass shed. He was spiraling, erratic, disoriented, perhaps trying to mislead the team, or simply completely unhinged. The ATS returned fire immediately. 2 minutes of relentless gunfire. Bullets tore through the air, splintered wood, shattered walls, and echoed across the hills. Through the gray haze, David Gray, a ghost with a rifle, fired wildly, his body jerking with each muzzle flash. A stray bullet sliced through a door crack and struck an ATS officer in the ankle, but the team held their ground. This time, he wouldn't escape. Above them, the Iroquois helicopter roared back, circling low like a giant eye in the sky, tracking every move. If Gray tried to flee into the bush, firepower would rain from above. The final standoff was here. David Gray, the cold-blooded killer, had been cornered, and this time there was no way out. 5:50 p.m., November 14th. David Gray made his final move. He burst out of the house, rifle in hand, firing from the hip, screaming like a madman. "Kill me, you F***ers, kill me now." But he didn't get far. A volley of shots rang out from the ATS officers. 5 bullets found their mark. 1 to the eye, 1 to the throat, 1 through the chest, and 2 to the groin. He collapsed, but refused to surrender. On the ground, David Gray writhed and thrashed, fighting against the plastic restraints, cursing and screaming at the officers for not killing him on the spot. Even as blood poured from his wounds, he resisted, as if his final breath was one last act of rebellion. Medics rushed in. They gave him oxygen and fought to keep him alive on the way to Dunedin Hospital. But it was too late. At 6:10 p.m., just kilometers from Aramoana, David Gray died. Inside the cage where he made his last stand, police uncovered a chilling scene. A personal armory stacked with rifles, ammo, tactical gear. Among them, a semi-automatic weapon resembling an AK-47, the very gun Gray used to unleash terror on that deadly Wednesday night. And slowly, the truth began to surface. David Gray, a loner and eccentric, had never truly been invisible. His deadly arsenal sat right in the middle of the community. Assault rifles, high-powered rounds, tactical accessories, hiding in plain sight. And no one ever suspected a thing. Aramoana had survived 2 nights of horror, but the cost, blood, grief, and 13 lost lives would haunt it forever. As the smoke cleared and silence fell over the town, the aftermath stood like a nightmare etched into reality. During the manhunt, police fired between 50 and 60 rounds, and over 150 officers were deployed, one of the largest tactical operations in New Zealand's history. The final 2 bodies, Riawa Bryson and Jasmine Holden, were discovered in the ashes of the Holden family home, burned to the ground in Gray's last descent into madness. In total, 14 people lost their lives, including children, parents, neighbors, and the killer himself, David Gray. Aramoana, the quiet seaside village, had been torn apart by a bloodstorm no one ever saw coming. The massacre forever changed how New Zealand viewed guns, safety, and itself. In the wake of the tragedy, gun laws were tightened, police strategies were re-examined, and the illusion of a violence-free country was shattered. But even as the headlines faded and the media moved on, one question lingered in a RMOANA ... and in all of us. How many warning signs must we ignore ... before a quiet man becomes a monster? Thank you for watching till the end. If you found this case as haunting as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, because we've got many more cases coming up that you won't want to miss.